about yourself. So people go around and they say their things, and I get to be, and I'm Karen Beth Fallon, I'm Deputy Solicitor for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And my interesting thing is I grew up on a cow-calf operation in Big Piney, Wyoming. And you would get blank stares. The people back in D.C. were good people. They had no idea what a cow-calf operation was, or what you do to make a living. I got so frustrated to go to the grocery store, and you'd stand at the meat counter, and stand at the milk case, and one time I was standing there to get some milk, and some kid was crying that he wanted real milk, and Mom handed him almond milk. And I turned around and left, because I thought, if I say something, it's going to be loud, and it's probably not going to be pleasant. So they don't understand who you are. Not that these people hate you, but they don't get it. So what they've asked me to come here and talk to you about today is 30 by 30. And I think if I wouldn't have been in Washington for those couple of years, I wouldn't understand how this works. So what I learned is when the president comes in, he sort of picks a theme, and everything you do has to be toward whatever the theme it was. And with President Trump, it was jobs. And so when they would go to you and the agencies and they'd say, we want you to rewrite ESA regulations, then as a justification to get the White House to agree to it, you had to say, this will make more jobs, or this will be less regulation, or this will be easier for people to make a living. And so you write these justifications for the White House, and that's how you get them convinced that what you were doing was right. So President Trump was jobs, President Biden's is climate change. And you saw that when he did his initial executive order discussing climate change and saying that is going to be his theme of his presidency. And so now everything they do is going to be tied to climate change. Now remember, executive orders are just like theories. You know, they're not worth the paper they're written on, quite honestly. You can't enforce them. But they create the theme so that you do regulations or manual changes or whatever to fit within this theme, and that's how you get it through the White House. So when we saw 30 by 30, I got to try to figure out what the heck it meant. And at the same time, USGS came out with a report, and you've got to let me put my glasses on because I don't remember numbers at all. I drive my husband completely insane. All right, so what the USGS determined is that there's 563 million acres of federal land in the U.S. right now. But according to them, only 12% of that land is managed to protect us from climate change. And according to the USGS reporting, remember USGS is the science body for the federal government. According to the USGS report, to preserve biodiversity is the way we're going to protect us from climate change, and all land has to be managed in its natural state. Right, so I got to looking at the 12%, which is what they say is right now protecting us from disaster, and you know what it is? It's wilderness. It's wild and scenic rivers. It's federal land where there are no uses. So if we're going to get from the current 12% of federal land, USGS estimates that you have to have 440 million acres of land in the U.S. managed only in its natural state to protect us from climate change. And the federal government wants to either acquire or change management of 440 percentages here, but I imagine it's somewhere in that marketplace. So on those federal lands, we're going to have to manage those in their natural state to be able to get up to this 440 million acres. There's no other way to do it. That means no grazing leases, no oil and gas, no mineral development. So I don't know how they're going to get to this 440 million acres, but that is the presidential goal by 2030. And so for somebody like me that's got a ranch and we've got a BLM permit as well as a Forest Service permit, it makes me really nervous because we have to have those permits if we're going to have a viable ranching operation. You know, as many of you know, actually, Secretary Zinke asked me to be BLM director. And when we got through all of the, the checks and all that stuff, you know the reason I wasn't BLM director? It's because they were going to make me sell my BLM allotment. And to sell your BLM allotment in Big Piney, Wyoming would have meant we'd sell the range. Not only that, I mean, this is how wild it got. Not only that, my husband grew up on a family-owned ranch in northern Nevada that he partly owns with his parents. And Nevada is 98% owned by the federal entities. I'm telling you, there's no private land ranches in Nevada. They were going to make my husband sell his BLM permits. So it took me exactly 1 second to say, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, no deal. So the question that you guys are all asking is, okay, so what is 30 by 30? How are they going to implement it? Well, the truth is, this is going to be death by 1,000 cuts. There's not going to be some big statute passed by Congress that says this is 30 by 30, but it's going to be bits and pieces. And some of the bits and pieces are already being implemented. So remember when Trump was president, Congress passed the Great Americans Outdoors Act. And one of the things Great American Outdoors Act is it provided permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund is the money that Congress has, that the agencies have to buy parklands and lands for recreation and lands for access. And because that was done so close to the end of the Trump administration, we didn't have time to write regulations, but we did put in an order from Secretary Bernhardt at the time that said if the federal government is going to acquire land, they have to have the agreement of the governor of the state and the local government. Because it sounds nice to say we're acquiring land, but it depends on where the land is as to how this works. If you're talking about the county where my father-in-law lives in northern Nevada, is already 98% owned by the federal government, that county commission is going to be very much opposed to the county having more federal land. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that I talked to my friends at when I was in D.C. is I said, you understand the federal government doesn't pay taxes on all these federal lands. They didn't know that. I had this big map in my office, and it showed where all the various federal lands were. So I had BLM lands in one color, and private lands, and Forest Service lands, and refuges, and Indian reservations, and it was all on this colored map. And I put stars up there. I hope nobody noticed them. I hope they're still there. So I had a star where the ranch is in Cheyenne, and one in Big Piney, and one in northern Nevada. And so when people would talk about land and conservation funds, I'd say, well, look at this map. You've got lots of lands in the east. It's all private. I said, I don't know what the county commission is going to think, but to them, taking land out of the tax base is a whole different ballgame than taking land out of the tax base in Sublette County, Wyoming, that's 78% owned by the federal government. That's why we required the agreement of the governor and the county commissioners. But because conservation fund, there is no requirement to talk to the governor or the county commissioners where the land is proposed to be purchased. And the reason they said that is because it would be too difficult and because they're worried about the theme of climate change. And last Friday, when I was at Wyoming Stock Growers, I saw the press release from Interior. When we were at Department of Interior, we wrote regulations for the Endangered Species Act. I was heavily involved in those regulations. Now, as you know, a species gets listed. It's based on biological information. That's what the statute says. And the biology wins every time, no questions asked. But critical habitat on both federal lands and private lands, that's where the impact is. Because under what something is designated as critical habitat, you cannot, quote, adversely modify the habitat. So one of the things that we did with the Trump administration is we defined adversely modify because it had never been defined. And what we said is adversely modified critical habitat has to be directly tied to a species. It can't just be a generally modified habitat. So we redefined this definition of adverse modification. And then one of the regulations we wrote was that Congress was very, very clear that critical habitat designation had to include economic, national security, and other relevant impacts. And so what we said is, number one, we defined relevant impacts. Nobody had ever defined that term. And we said relevant impacts are jobs, which we had to say together through the White House, okay? Jobs. Community development. Adverse environmental impacts. Because you can't just assume that locking up land is good for the environment. I mean, look at the catastrophic wildfires. When I came up here, I saw a big burned area. That is not good for the environment, folks. Or invasive weeds or invasive species. So we said, Fish and Wildlife Service, you have to consider that when you designate critical habitat. Because one of the things that is really important to understand is that Congress said that critical habitat does not have to be designated unless the species goes extinct. Okay? So it's not for conservation and recovery. The environmental groups will argue and argue and argue, and they'll say, well, you've got to have critical habitat for conservation and recovery. Read the statute. The statute says only if the species is going to go extinct. I mean, I think that is a huge distinction. And so we brought that out in our regulations, and one of the things we said in the regulations is that local governments specifically could comment on economic, national security, which is, I mean, that's more normally, homeland security, and other relevant impacts, and the federal government had to consider their comments. Now, if the species is going to go extinct, it's too bad for the local government. I mean, we can't let the species go extinct, but otherwise, look at what those local governments say. And so, this Biden administration press release that came out Friday, I was really grumpy on Friday. I was at Wyoming Stock Growers, and I apologize to all my friends in Wyoming. I admit it, I was grumpy. But he wants to change those regulations to include climate change. And I will tell you, I read the Endangered Species Act cover to cover, and all of the regulations, lots of times, climate change is not mentioned once. And one of the other things that we did during the Trump administration, and that most most of you know the ESA sets up two categories of species, threatened species and endangered species. But once they're listed as under threatened or endangered, then what the federal government had always done is treated everything endangered. And we said, no, no, no. Congress used two words that must have meant they had two different things in mind. So therefore, when you have a threatened species, the only thing you can regulate are direct threats to the species. And everything else you gotta leave alone. It's called the 4D rules. And so it required Fish and Wildlife Service, you figure out the threats and you address the threats. And everything else is off the table. The Biden press release said it is going to go back and it wants to change our regulation to treat everything as endangered again. But don't you guys think our way makes sense? You've got an issue, let's deal with the issue and then get the stupid thing off the list. Now, one of the things that we did is working with Secretary Bernhardt, who'd also been in the Bush administration as solicitor, he understood the power of regulations. And that's why we wrote those very detailed regulations and went through a big public process. So Biden can't just get rid of this stuff. He's got to go through the regulatory process. We did the same thing with NEPA. Oh, the NEPA thing really drives me nuts. So they keep saying the new Trump regulations for NEPA will never consider climate change. It doesn't say that. What the new NEPA regulation said is that we are going to consider the effect of the action. Just the effect, not make up all this other like unrelated stuff in an EIS or an EA. You consider the effect. And the truth is, if you can show that your proposed action is going to affect the climate, you got to study it. But you got to connect the dots to show the effect. So we did consider, we are going to allow consideration of climate. But you just got to show, you got to connect the dots. Not just lump it all in there and assume the federal agency can deal with it. And we did it through regulation because we're going to make them undo us through regulations. So I am worried about 30 by 30. I've heard people say, well, there's not enough detail in the plans. I don't think it's the plans you got to look at. I think it's death by 1,000 cuts, and you got to look at this action here, and this action over here, this action over here. I mean, I got to tell you, the federal government never does anything big. They just do like a million little things, like you guys get regulated in a million different ways. It's the same thing. So I think we've got to be diligent and really watch. I know people are looking at the watch. I've only had a half hour. I apologize. I get all whacked out.
Okay, you're good.
So people ask me, so what are we going to do? I'm sitting here at a cattlemen's meeting. This is all way above me. What am I going to do? The first thing I think you've got to do is I think you've got to get really diligent about figuring out your economic impacts. Because the Trump administration, until new rules are written, those have to be considered. And it's not just, what does livestock mean to the state of Montana? I know there's lots of that stuff. But I would sit down in your local ranches and I would think, okay, so where do I buy most of my groceries? Where do I buy my tractors? And figure out what your local economic impact is and then get that to your county commissioners. Because they've got to understand the economic impact in just their county. Because when we were writing these regulations, we wrote it down to the county level. And then the truth is, in Wyoming and Montana, that's not so bad. But when you're talking about states like Oregon, I mean, their governor's nuts. And you're talking about all of eastern Oregon, where it's ranches just like you guys got. I mean, that's why we did that, is to help some of those states where you had ginormous population centers who elect everybody and the part of the state gets left out. So you've got to do that on your local level, and I would absolutely get started on that. What Wyoming did is we actually got funds from the legislature to help these, because you got rural counties, you know, and they don't have all that great a budget, but we got funds from the legislature to help the counties actually do this kind of analysis, so that they could be prepared, so that when they propose to designate critical habitat for some worm or some bug or some whatever the heck, you can respond under the 4B2 rules. I would really get, I would work very hard. I get your neighbors to understand the importance of places like stock growers, because they're going to be able to sort of watch all of these different places to know, well, they're changing this rule. How does it affect us? They're changing this over here, because like I said, it's not going to be just one giant sweep of a bill from Congress, or the Democrats from Congress. It's going to be a little bit here and a little bit there, and I would really look at all those little bits and kind of tie them all together. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to end with a couple of stories. One of them because I think it's just hysterical, and the other is kind of a lesson that I'm now starting to end my speeches to keep people to understand how important this all is. So first, let's start with the hysterical story. All right, so my daughter's in law school, right? She just finished a couple of weeks ago, and this year, for some reason, we ended up with 4 levy cabs. I don't, just some years you have more than others, so this year we ended up with 4, and so Sarah was like, oh, let me take them to Laramie. My kids are going to love bottle feeding these baby calves. And she had a big privacy fenced backyard. It's in town, so it's not exactly legal, but she's cute and she figures she can get away with it, okay? So she hauled these 2 lucky calves to Laramie, and all of her law school friends are just, she's got people lined out the door to feed these babies. All right, so this got on a couple of months and everything is going fine. Well, just a couple of nights ago, she called, and somehow or the other, they jimmied the lock on the gate open after they'd been fed in the evening, and these calves get out. And so Sarah and her friends are all running all over trying to find these 2 baby calves, and they can't find them, and finally a cop bot pulls by, and they see Sarah running around, and they're like, do you have a couple of calves? And she's like, well, yeah, maybe. And he said, well, they're about 4 blocks over, and some lady put them in her backyard because she saw them walking down the street. They didn't know what to do with them. So Sarah and her friend go over, and they put halters on these calves, and they get the calves drugged back to the backyard. The story's way longer than I made it, but she said it was actually pretty hysterical. Watch these 2 girls drag these calves down the street. So she gets them back in the backyard, and the next day, she gets a call from animal control. And so they said, we need you to come in and meet with us. So she's like, well, the jig is up, I'm in trouble. So she gets dressed, and she goes down to animal control, and she walks in, and she said there's this really big guy, and he's got a uniform on, so she figures this is the guy, and he says to her, I hear you got a couple of calves in your backyard. And she said, oh no, sir, those animals in my backyard self-identify as dogs. She said the guy was laughing so hard. She's taken the bar this year, and then she's coming to work for us. So I got a really bright attorney coming to work for me. And the guy was laughing so hard, he's like, okay, you can keep him there until you move back to Cheyenne. All right, so I just think that story's so funny. I'm going to tell it to everybody because I was just cracking up. So the story I want to end with is I want to talk to you a little bit about the U.S. Constitution. Yep. The older I get, the more important I understand that document is. The Constitution just means foundation. So if you don't have a solid foundation for your house, it's going to collapse. If we don't have a solid foundation for this country, it's going to collapse. people get it all mixed up because they hear constitutional rights. The Constitution does not give you rights. God gives you rights. The Constitution is the document that was written to stop the government from taking your rights. And I think people forget that as they're thinking about the foundation of the country. When the federal government does something, it's got to have a rule or a statute as a basis for whatever it is they do, whatever regulation they write, whatever they tell you to do. It's not the same for you guys. You guys can do anything you want as long as there's not a statute prohibiting it. So see the difference? And we got to just keep that in mind. One time a guy sent me one of the very first American dictionaries ever written, Noah Webster. Everybody's heard of Noah Webster, right? And there was a thing in the front that said that the reason he wrote the first dictionary, and he was a contemporary of the founding fathers, he wrote the first dictionary to keep the courts from changing the meanings of the words in the Constitution. It didn't have anything to do with whether you all could spell better. It was because they so believed that the words of the Constitution were something this country had to stand on. And it was really fascinating to start looking at the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were the writings of the founding fathers. They wrote the Constitution, and then a bunch of states said, we're not going to sign this thing unless you include the Bill of Rights, the individual rights. So the Federalist Papers were the documents that the founders wrote to convince people that the Bill of Rights was enough protection, and that they should adopt the Constitution because the Articles of Confederation, that didn't work. And if you look at the Federalist Papers and the other documents, all of those rights were in there based on the protection of private property. The Second Amendment was in there based on the right to protect private property. The right to free assembly, the right to freedom of speech, that was considered property. And so I think that if for our kids and our grandkids, we got to do everything in our power to protect our private property. And I think if we remember that and we continue to fight with that basis, that we're going to be able to weather 30 by 30 or whatever else comes against us in this administration or whoever else is president on down the line. What you guys are doing for the country is incredible. Most people have no idea where their food comes, but I know it's right here. And you should be very proud of who you are and what you're doing for the United States of America. It's important.